as the Trump administration has deregulation as one of its, we're going to cut taxes, rein in spending, deregulate. It's an increasingly important sector to work on. And you guys have a lot to work with in terms of stuff to undo or to restructure.
When it comes to delete, yeah, we're never going to lack for material.
Well, welcome to the Leave Us Alone podcast, the podcast that champions individual freedom and limited government. I'm your host, Grover Norquist, and we're going to be talking with Nathan Simington, who is a commissioner on the FCC, incoming, a great deregulator with lots of exciting stories about what is yet to come in the Trump administration on deregulation. And I'm joined here with James now, and we're going to be talking about what happens in the Senate. Last we were chatting together, the big, beautiful tax cut, lower spending bill was passed by the House of Representatives by Ways and Means, and then by the entire House by a vote of one vote margin.
Well, it would have been 3, but 2 members went to sleep. They said they would vote for it, though, if they'd been awake.
You know, I know people at home are tempted to say they were hiding in a closet, they weren't sleeping. I've talked to enough congressmen because both when the Ways and Means Committee was bringing this up and then the whole floor, this was up till 8 in the morning, 7 in the morning. People were sneaking back to their rooms, trying to sleep for just a little bit. And it is not surprising that 2 people weren't woken up by staff and dragged over to the Capitol when the final vote was made. It also, once they won by 1 vote, my guess is that the whip, who might have been an alarm clock, if necessary, they'd have gone and found them if they needed those votes. But they didn't. So James is with me. And James, how do you see where we are as the tax reduction spending restraint bill has now passed the House and is headed over to the Senate?
Well, this week is Memorial Day recess, so the Senate is not taking it up right away, but they're beginning their negotiations. What's unusual this time, it's a little different from most reconciliation bills we've had in the past, is that the Senate always likes to think that they're very important and, we jam the House. The House will send us something and we'll do whatever we want and they'll just have to eat it. That's not the same this time because the House actually, for once, has a narrower margin than the Senate. I guess it's about the same, but when you scale that to having 4.5 times as many members, the House margin is a lot closer. So this might be one of the few times in history where the Senate basically just has to accept what the House has done, although that doesn't mean they won't make some changes around the edges, some of which we expect to be very good. For example, on the pro-growth measures, which were probably the most important part of this big, beautiful bill. There's a lot of important stuff in it, but making sure we have good pro-growth policy that helps us grow the economy, overcome deficits in the long term, and allow people to keep more of their own money to invest, to flourish, and, well, of course, politically help Republicans before the midterms if you get the economy growing through 2026. We expect the Senate to try and make some of those provisions permanent. The House extended, this is R&D expensing, this is full expensing for equipment, this is carried interest. There are many of these provisions that make it easier to do business and especially easier to invest in America, which were very successful in the 2017 Trump tax cut. Those, the House had extended for 4 to 5 years, depending on which provision we're talking about. The Senate is likely to want to make them permanent. And some of that has to do with making the sums balance out at the end of a 10-year window. The Senate, however, is wisely pursuing a current policy baseline. We've talked about this many times before on the podcast, but basically the Senate is saying that we are going to calculate what the deficit in the future will be based on what the deficit, the way the math works now. We're not going to pretend there's a tax cut nobody will vote for or allow to happen in a few years and say, well, if we don't allow this tax cut to happen, a tax increase. If you don't allow this tax increase to happen, you're actually adding to the deficit. It's an absurd way to count things. Taking a current policy baseline says whatever is coming in now, we're going to take that as our revenue baseline, and we're going to go off of that in the future. And there are a lot of people right now that are complaining on Twitter, not a lot, but some people that are complaining on Twitter, some people who like to pretend that they're the most conservative people in the room, who are very upset that their Republicans are not interested in allowing an automatic tax increase and claiming it is adding to the deficit because they're not allowing an automatic tax increase. And this is a notion of which they should be swiftly disabused.
Well, this has been a problem for decades where under reconciliation, you can cut taxes for and for 10 years. But if you go outside the 10-year window, you have to, quote unquote, pay for that by reducing spending on entitlements, which is not always easy to do politically, or raising taxes somewhere else, which is kind of counterproductive. We'll raise taxes here and cut them there and call it a day. Well, it's not what you want to do. You want to reduce the overall tax burden. We are in a position now where we look back and say it was always a mistake to have every 5 years or every 10 years this cliff, because the cliff was always a place where the left could argue, just sit still and there'd be a massive tax increase. And the Democrats could have, if we help you avoid the massive tax increase, what do you give us? It ends up with more spending, with fewer tax cuts, with lower tax reduction. Taking that off the table and saying once we've passed a tax cut, it will be permanent and treated that way as we move forward is a huge, huge step forward. It will talk about savings. The most important reduction in spending that is in this bill is by making it permanent so that future cliffs, future fiscal cliffs, can never be used to blackmail people into spending increases.
And it should be noted that the spending reforms and the reforms to Medicaid, the reforms to SNAP, and some of the other economizing that happens in the One Big Beautiful Bill, it's going to make a $1.6 trillion real permanent cut to the baseline spending projections of the U.S. government. That is the biggest single spending cut in any bill, any reconciliation bill in living memory, partisan or bipartisan. Obviously, the government's spending far more than it ever has anyway, so that it's not solving the entire problem. But the idea that some people seem to have that this real massive $1.6 trillion cut in spending to the baseline is not enough, and therefore you have to raise taxes. It's a little absurd at that point. Now, some people were complaining that some of the reforms to repealing the Green New Deal credits or the Medicaid work requirements require people to go look for work or volunteer in order to live off the public dole if they are able-bodied, that they don't kick in soon enough. And that was a perfectly legitimate criticism of the bill. Leadership heard that, they changed it, they were accommodated, and that's what really brought most of the conservatives, the most conservative members of the House, on board late into the night at the end.
The $1.6 trillion reduction in spending, that is over a 10-year period?
Yes.
And that is repeated every 10 years into the future?
Yes.
Okay. So
and it compounds.
Well, you wonder what the present value of $1.6 trillion every 10 years out is, because it is a lot more than $1.6 trillion.
Exactly.
That would be a number to look up. Very helpful one. We also have a fact that's not being mentioned enough, although Mr. Hassett, the economist for the White House, has pointed this out. If we grow at 1.5%, which is sort of what we've been doing with Biden world and COVID world, but if we go instead not 1.5%, but a 3% growth each year out into the future, just 3% a year, which is very doable given the tax reduction here and the deregulation that we're looking at doing as well, that over 10 years, by growing at 3% a year instead of 1.5%, the debt is reduced, the debt is reduced by $4 trillion over the course of that decade. And that is almost exactly as big as the tax cut. So when we talk about tax cut being paid for, if you look at growth, the tax cut is largely being paid for through growth. And any tax increase reduces that growth. So the key thing here is grow the economy, grow the economy, grow the economy. That makes the economy grow faster than the debt. That makes the debt a smaller problem every.
And I think our friends at the Tax Foundation have calculated that by making these provisions permanent, if the Senate chooses to do so on some of the pro-growth provisions we were talking about, if those are allowed to be permanent fixtures of the tax code, you will increase the expected growth over the next decade from, in the wake of One Big Beautiful Bill, from 2% to 3%, I believe.
Well, that's what we're looking for.
And so that's one thing they can add to it. Is there another provision that the Senate might consider adding to the bill when it comes across their desk?
Well, there's a oldie but goodie, an idea which was first put forward by Paul Ryan and had a lot of support, which would end the taxation of your mutual fund of the capital gains inside it. So you own a bunch of stocks, they buy and sell them, your mutual fund during the year. And while you didn't take any money out at all, you quote unquote made a gain, unless stock market goes down in the future. But at present, you made an imaginary gain and they tax you on it. Now that's what they do. This would say, no, you only tax people on capital gains build up in their mutual funds when you take the money out. So you don't have the ups and the downs that you have to make adjustments for. And you also allow that money to accrue, to grow tax-free until it's taken out. That would tremendously increase capital per person in the United States. About 33 million Americans, the money they save is in mutual funds. That's 33 million people who would benefit, be able to save more and have a better retirement by getting rid of this stupid tax in the middle of their building up their nest egg. So that is something that I hope can be put into this bill, either for several years so that people get used to it and demand it made permanent. Perhaps permanency would be difficult because you're competing with many existing projects, but do it for 4 years and then demonstrate to people how good it is for them. And then 33 million Americans will go, okay, Buster, don't ever let this go away.
Yeah, and when you're working from a current policy baseline, as the Senate plans to do, you've got a lot more flexibility on making those numbers work, especially if we're talking about, say, a $7.5 billion. I mean, in the scheme of things with this type of bill, that's not very much. We're talking about a $1.6 trillion real permanent cut, $7.5 billion per year in supposedly lost tax revenue, $15 billion over 2 years. That's not very much. That can make that work. And then when you come back, well, that's your new policy baseline. So it doesn't cost you anything to extend that into the future. And now you have millions of Americans, 33 million Americans own stocks and mutual funds.
That is it. That is exactly our strategy as soon as we explain it to the congressman.
Yeah, well, but hopefully you come back and you have these people saying, look, so what happened to my investments? And this fake taxable event that didn't happen. I'm not getting penalized for wanting to reinvest when I didn't take the money at all.
Congress will create the lobby of 33 million Americans to continue this.
Sounds pretty populist.
Yep, it is.
Speaking of which, we have an interview coming up with Commissioner Simington of the FCC, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show. And he has been a foremost advocate of deregulation over at the Communications Commission. They have a lot of power in the United States in the government. They don't get as much attention as they probably deserve because they do a lot of work overseeing how the internet works, how communications are governed. And there's a lot of legacy regulations that broadcasters have lobbied for over the years. When we had different rules, there's a lot of self-serving interests that have gotten their little fingers in the FCC over time. And the FCC, under this new administration, has launched a rulemaking they literally call it delete, 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 where they're just asking everybody, they threw the doors open, give us any suggestion you have on something we can delete from the regulatory code, something to make it easier to do business in the communications industry. We submitted comments. We talked a lot about how there are rules preventing broadcasters from owning more than 2 stations in a local market based on what the market looked like in World War II. When there was no cable TV, there was no satellite, and there was certainly no internet. In fact, most Americans didn't even own a television, but back then it was, this will be a monopoly, so you can't have more than 2 broadcast stations. As a result, today, the broadcast industry is dying, and they can't consolidate, and they can't grow. So that's something they're looking at addressing. We talked about some of the reporting requirements from the Cable Act, where all these cable companies have to give reports on what they're retransmitting, on what they're carrying, basically to pay off the broadcasters based on an agreement that was made in the 70s about all that. There's a lot of stuff from before I was born, a lot of it from before where you were born as well, Grover, that we can definitely start eviscerating from the code. And it's great to see that the commissioners are interested in doing that. And I think you and Commissioner Simington are going to have a nice chat about that and some other issues that are facing the communications landscape in America today. But before we hear that, I would like to communicate to you that if you're enjoying the discussion today, please take a moment to rate and review Leave Us Alone on your favorite podcast platform. We are looking to grow our own lobby, 33 million strong, and your support will help us reach more and more listeners so we can have as great as reach as the mutual fund industry. Don't forget to share this episode with your friends and family. Now, back to the conversation.
Okay, well, Grover Norquist here, and we at Leave Us Alone have a special guest star, Nathan Simington, who is a commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission. And I was wondering if you could start with how many commissioners on the commission, and they're picked on a partisan basis. How does this work?
Yeah, great question. So there are currently 4 with a maximum of 5. And by convention, the president designates a co-partisan as chair. The chair sets the agenda and has a great deal of control over the agency. So there, in the statute, it says you can't have more than 3 from a single party. And again, by convention, whoever is the sitting chair, regardless of party, resigns on Inauguration Day, allowing the president to choose a new chair even if he's reelected. So right now, former Commissioner Carr is now Chairman Carr because he was designated very early by President Trump for the future chair and then was duly seated on Inauguration Day. Olivia Trusty has been nominated for the 3rd Republican seat, and her confirmation is probably expected in June.
At which point you would then have a 3-2 majority and the Republicans could do fill in the blank.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Frankly, even without a full voting majority, the chair has a great deal of control over how the agency works by setting internal policies and by having things done at the staff level. So that's sometimes a new area of FCC practice to people who don't have a lot of FCC experience. We do a lot on delegated authority, so-called. When I tell this to FTC people, they always get very jumpy because the FTC votes everything. But the FCC does a lot at the staff level, and therefore the chair has a lot of control.
When I called Karl Rove, when George W. Bush was president, and said, who is in charge of FCC telecommunications policy? And he gave me the name of some intern in the basement. And I said, you do know that the answer when I called the Clinton White House on this was Al Gore, the vice president. And the focus of the Democrats under Clinton and Gore on the importance of the FCC for their political agenda and their ability to control communications seemed much deeper and stronger and more serious than the Republican one, which thought we're going to be in charge of stopping people from saying dirty words and that will cover it. Because those are the people who call us on the phone about this. Or I was told, we have friends on both sides of issue X, so we don't want to do anything. Is the Trump administration, the modern Republican Party, a little more focused on the importance of what the FCC does? And perhaps if you could give some examples for listeners, what kind of decisions do you make that people might think Congress does or that the private sector makes?
Yeah, well, the Communications Act and then the Telecommunications Act give us a very broad remit. So you can sum up the jurisdiction as saying all interstate and international communication by wire or radio. So you were talking about the Clinton era. There was going to be a huge amount of focus on media regulation, both in terms of hard and soft power for getting the broadcast media to do things. I would say that when you look at the potential economic value of the FCC, it's much, much broader than that, particularly today when everything's networked, everything's on the internet. So we regulate the satellite system. If you want to send or receive satellite signals in or out of the United States, you need an FCC license for that. We regulate mobile telephony, which is these days how people get a lot of broadband. So it's a lot bigger than just media regulation. And in fact, the media regulation part of what we do has shrunk because so much media has moved online and thus out of our jurisdiction that I think the media regulation part of what we do is just, is shrinking with the broadcast industry.
And yet one of the things you focused on is some rules about who can own how many radio, TV stations, newspapers. What is that, and why in the heck is the federal government telling people what they can and cannot own?
Yeah, we should get rid of it. That's absolutely.
When did it start, and can we get rid of it?
Oh, yeah. Well, so Congress has set us some parameters that were intended to prevent overconcentration in the hands of a single individual or a single company of control over broadcasting. And the thought here, and I'm not necessarily justifying it, but just outlining the logic, the thought was that when you have a broadcasting license, that's also an exclusionary license because you're preventing other people from using those frequencies.
You have a monopoly.
Yeah, it's a local monopoly over that frequency for speech. And so if we were to be a little too cavalier in granting those local speech monopolies and allowing the concentration in single hands, then it's not merely that people would be able to speak freely to the extent that they can afford the press. I mean, we've never restricted newspapers in that way, although let me put a footnote on that one in a minute. But with broadcasting, it's exclusionary in a way that newspapers are not because there's always a shortage of spectrum. So all of the media regulation rules that we have really flow from this premise that the airwaves are a public trust and the common property of the American people, and that therefore exclusionary uses of those airwaves invite a heightened government interest in the ownership and control of speech.
That said, if I have a radio station or a TV station, I'm actually competing for news with newspapers and Twitter and any number of things. So if you define any market narrowly enough, everybody's a monopoly. You are the only gas station on this corner. You're a monopoly. Never mind the guy across the street or the guy who will give you electricity for your car, which is another way of doing cars. What can and should the FCC do to liberalize these rules?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I completely agree with you. Whatever the arguments were against broadcast ownership concentration at one point, they've just been weakened by the passage of time and the emergence of new communications media. To the extent they were ever justified, they're far less justified now than they've ever been. So in terms of deregulation, there's a lot of very ticky-tacky and hard to predict regulation around control of affiliations, control of the top stations in markets. Those regulations are not required by Congress and should simply be removed.
And that's a 3-2 vote and you win?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And there are things that we could do even before we get to 3-2 to weaken much of that. A lot of it is really just customary practice and was not instantiated by regulation in the first place. In fact, I would say that some of it is illegal non-APA rulemaking, for example, by putting arbitrary conditions on the grant or transfer of licenses. So those are things that could go away even before we're 3-2, but certainly once we're 3-2, there could be an omnibus that clears up a lot of this deadwood. As far as concentration of ownership rules, we do have some guardrails from Congress on that. And the FCC obviously shouldn't be lawless and simply disregard Congress. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of nuances of how these have been interpreted and how we've calculated market size here that would give us ample elbow room for deregulation even within the congressional legal framework.
Okay. Now, net neutrality was a thing. Is it still a thing? Could you walk through what that fight was about? Because neutrality sounds pretty good. What was the argument back and forth, and where do we stand now? Are we undoing Biden things at present or about to?
So again, Grover, I love your framing, because if we say net neutrality, the obvious antonym is internet bias or something like it. Who would want that? But if you look at how net neutrality was originally framed in the Tim Wu paper in 2003, in which the term was coined, it meant essentially no blocking, no throttling, no fast lanes, that if you were an internet infrastructure provider, you should treat every bit equally. And Wu's argument at the time was that we shouldn't necessarily favor a particular protocol or service provider because we didn't yet know what the right optimizations would be, and we might entrench bad practices. To the extent that that was true in 2003, it's certainly not true today. And what's more, many people tried to do bills, including Republicans, that would enshrine in law no blocking, no throttling, no fast lanes. When people were asking for net neutrality, what they were really asking for was Title II net neutrality. That is, classifying broadband internet access services as a Title II communications service, the same category as regulated phone rates, and getting net neutrality through those means. And you can see this because they wouldn't support legislation to enshrine those key principles of net neutrality. They wanted the whole enchilada, including probably rate regulation.
So net neutrality is the word they used, but what they really wanted was to have more unfettered government control of the internet.
That's right. They wanted to apply the same rules that came from the AT&T regulated monopoly system to broadband internet access to the home. Now, the first decisive tilt in this direction was the 2015 Open Internet Order under the Wheeler administration, which did impose these Title II regulatory frameworks. The thing about that is that the Wheeler administration itself recognized that that wasn't workable because they used a provision in the Telecom Act, the forbearance provision, to remove most of the statutory provisions from the rule. So basically, they neutralized about 700 provisions and retained about 4. So, you could call that rewriting the statute through regulation if you wanted.
But at present, you are likely to undo this completely or do something different?
Well, it's already been overturned in the Sixth Circuit. So the Biden administration brought this back after it was repealed under the Pai administration. So under Obama, we got, in other words, we got Title II. It got taken away again under Trump's first term. Then under Biden, it got brought back, but it got rejected in the courts before it was ever enforced for anything. And
Isn't it something like a vampire or something that even if the court said it can't be there, courts can change their mind? Do you not have to go back and undo it anyway just to make sure it doesn't pop back?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think at this point, there's an understanding that this is a dead letter and that at some point we clear out the underbrush, but it's a dead letter and it shouldn't affect how anyone behaves.
You're selling off spectrum as a way to reduce the deficit. You're selling spectrum to the private sector so it can be better used. What's the status of that now? And what is spectrum? Isn't that the guy that James Bond fights?
Yeah, well, right. So when we say spectrum, it's shorthand for a license to operate, to transmit in a particular frequency in a particular place at a particular power level. So when we say we're selling spectrum, what we really mean is we're selling the licenses to operate cell towers and to have phones talk to them. For example, in the case of wireless mobility or some other right to use a radio, we're selling those in geographically bound licenses for particular frequencies and power levels. So when we talk about commercializing spectrum, what we're doing is we're saying that there's some government entity that currently has the right to use or to restrict from use in those frequencies in an area, and we want to offer that to the marketplace. Obviously, these licenses can be tremendously valuable, and although they're not perfectly liquid, the license rights are also tradable.
So you sell it to somebody, that person finds there's a better, higher use, he can sell it to somebody else.
Yeah, there's a very active...
Forever or for some 5-year period?
Typically, license rights in wireless mobility, for example, are 15-year rights. It really depends on the particular license, and that's a decision that's made at the time.
Why not like land? Why not let it, you bought it, you own it forever, and you can sell it?
Again, great question. And part of it is that when we're licensing spectrum, we're implicitly making engineering decisions about how that license should work. And if that license were a perpetual license, then we would be enshrining engineering decisions that were no longer applicable. So it's good to bring the question back every so often.
Okay. And the Universal Service Fund, what does that do? Does it need fixing, repairing, eating?
Yeah. So the roots of it have to do with monopoly AT&T, like so many things. Monopoly AT&T had a system of cross subsidies internally where basically urban paid for rural because you had fewer users on a particular piece of infrastructure, and then where business paid for home use because business users would be charged a great deal more for technically identical service. And this system of cross subsidies started to fall apart, obviously, when AT&T was broken up. No, Monopoly AT&T, the Bell system was broken up. And then the final remnants of them were struck down with a 1989 FCC report and order. This left the services, I guess, less affordable than people had been accustomed to in some cases, and that led to the adoption of the Universal Service Fund concept in the 96 Telecommunications Act. The idea was that there'd be a small levy on everyone's bill, 2 or 3%, and that would fund the cross-subsidy regime similar to what we had seen before.
So the cross-subsidy is not in the pricing, but in the subsidy?
That's right, to the
So that's a little less stupid.
Yeah. So we thought that we would set up some programs for computers in schools, for phones for low-income users, that kind of thing. The thing is that the funding base for this has shrunk immensely while demand has grown. And now we're faced not with a 2 or 3% levy on your bill, but with a 30 or 40% levy on your bill. And it resets quarterly, so businesses can't even plan around it.
And the fix to this is, in 20 seconds?
Yeah, well, there are basically 3 ways to get rid of it. Number 1, you get rid of it. Number 2, you move it from phone bills to internet bills. And number 3, you say that internet companies are the beneficiaries of network effects, and so you bill against them. And all of those have their problems.
How much is the subsidy for somebody who lives in a rural area? If they lost the subsidy, it does what?
Well, that's the other thing, is that like a lot of subsidies, this one has sort of metastasized over time. So it's not as simple as saying we're giving you a discount on your phone bill. This rural user may not even have a regular phone service at all, or there may be no relation between the cost that they're paying and the cost of operation of, some residual old tech lube. Now, nowadays, we basically do 4 things. We have the E-rate program. That's for technology and connectivity in schools. That's the lion's share of it. There's the Lifeline program, perhaps better known to people as the Obama phone program.
Oh, is that still going?
Yeah.
Can I get an Obama phone?
If you're sufficiently poor, you can get a $10 a month service, yeah. And so obviously $10 a month is not attractive to most companies, so there are specialist companies that operate in this space. There are some good players there, but it's known as a magnet for fraud, to be quite honest. And we've had to engage in some aggressive enforcement at the FCC level on this. There's also a rural subsidy program and a telehealth subsidy program. So
Okay. As we wrap up, could you give a summary of what, when you have the 3-2 majority, you expect what to happen in the next year? What is the to-do list?
Chairman Carr has signaled that his priorities are spectrum commercialization. He led with the spectrum commercialization item at the first meeting and has pressed on it relentlessly since. So that's a big one. His second priority, if you look at his work in the first term under Pai, it was on infrastructure construction and permitting and expediting construction and permitting, putting shot clocks essentially in for small cells to prevent NIMBYs from restricting building them. So he signaled he's going to do more of that, and he's got a track record there that we can easily point to. And then I think, the third thing that's just very obviously needs to happen is broadcast media reform. About a year ago, Chairman Carr said that we were in a break the glass situation for this. I agree with his assessment, both then and now. I think we are going to start seeing media bankruptcies for real, and perhaps licenses going dark as stations are unable to function, or to the extent they are able to function, it will be as low-value rerun stations that no one will watch, that don't do local journalism anymore. So I think it's very important to find new ways to bring capital into that sector.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much. As the Trump administration has deregulation as one of its, we're going to cut taxes, rein in spending, deregulate. It's an increasingly important sector to work on. And you guys have a lot to work with in terms of stuff to undo or to restructure.
When it comes to delete, yeah, we're never going to lack for material.
Okay, Nathan Simington, thank you very, very much for joining us. Member of the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, one of those alphabet agencies created way back under FDR when?
In 1934.
1934. So one of the early stupid things they did. Okay, got it. Thank you. Grover Norquist here with Leave Us Alone, and we'll go back to our regularly programmed schedule.